Hello everyone, welcome back to Xplane 11 and the C172. We are at Rafha airfield in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert, and we're going to be heading for Oscar Echo Papa Alpha, which is Hafr al-Batin. It's about 120 nautical miles trip, and it's the second to last desert flight before we hit the Gulf, so I'm looking forward to getting away from the desert. As you can see, we've been spawned at the wrong end of the runway, but I'm not going to do anything about that. We're just going to have to make a downwind takeoff with perhaps a slight crosswind right to left. Jump in the cockpit now, and we'll start going through our startup sequence. So cockpit is all secure. Check that I'm buckled in. Yes. No, it's behind me, but it's buckled in. And we will now check all the breakers are in, which they are. Very good. Beacon can come on. And we'll turn the battery and the avionics on just so we can get our system set up. We've got 1200 showing on the transponder, and I've got Oscar Echo Papa Alpha as my waypoint. Just the one waypoint for this flight, and I'm not putting the departure airfield in as a waypoint. We're just going to go straight out to Hafr al-Batin. Okay, I'm just going to call it Papa Alpha, I think. Great, we're fine there. We'll check the fuel is... Shutter is in, and we are set to the both, which we are. And then we can check the flaps are up, which they were not. Fuel quantity, we are on about 10 gallons. That should just be enough to get us there. That will be probably the last flight on this tank, and then we're going to have to get some more fuel. Park brake. And we would normally radio in for a requesting start, but we're not going to do that because we're not using the ATC here. We're going to use old IVAO. And I'm just going to get a flight plan and connect to this. So I'll just go about that now, and then we'll be back in a second once I'm all connected. Very good. Everything's plugged in there. Now we can start turning everything off here. Throttle to idle. Avionics off, battery off and alternator off. Fuel pump is in the off position, and the mixture is fully lean. So we should be ready for start now. Brakes and battery. Mixture lean, 1/4 on there. We'll get the fuel pump, we'll go rich now. Fuel pump on, look for fuel flow. Okay, we're showing fuel flow. It's a bit wobbly, but we are showing fuel flow, so I'm going to take the word for it. And we can now lean the mixture. Fuel pumps off, ignition on whilst jiggling the old throttle about. Willy-nilly, here we go. Okay, going to set for 1000 RPM. And you'll notice that there's smoke in the cockpit. That is the particle effects that they've just introduced into Xplane into the beta. They said they had removed the particle effects from the cockpit because players were reporting problems. But as you can see, I'm not sure if it'll show on the video, but I definitely do have smoke particles in the cockpit. So that's still a bug. Okay, setting for 1000 RPM now. We can turn the avionics on. And we can turn the taxi, nav and strobe on. We don't need the fuel pump, we don't need the pitot heat. We'll do a quick run up here whilst we're at the static position. Confirm rich, 1800 RPM, and then we'll do a quick mag check. Good. Whoops. Just about overcooked it there with the mouse. Back to 1000 RPM. We'd now get clearance to take off, which we're not going to do because there's no ATC, there's nobody here. So brakes will be off and we'll get ourselves away. Now I've noticed that I actually have to have quite a lot of backstick on the Cessna to stop it from oversteering. If I have the stick neutral or forward, it massively oversteers, and it's very difficult to control this airplane. So as you can see, we're airborne already. There's that tiny bit of crosswind we saw from the windsock, but it's not too serious. And we're climbing out now. Going to leave the mixture where it is till at least 3,000 feet. RPM looks okay. Fuel flow looks okay. T's and P's are all good. And we need to track on 114. So we're going to have to turn around and go the other way because we are heading west. Turn around through to the north here. And we can check the flaps are up, which they are. I'm now also going to ident, I think, just for full disclosure. Probably should have done that before takeoff. Taxi off. Beacon at nav and strobe can remain on. Turning pretty rapidly here. Okay, we've just overturned a fraction and we're going to climb. Another clear day. Although we do have some very high cloud, which is nice to see. They've done a lot of work apparently on the effects in this sim over the past couple of beta releases, so I'm very keen to see how that pans out. We may get a bit of a look at some of those features. Okay, let's adjust our heading onto 114. In fact, it's there already, so we'll be able to shove the autopilot on once we get up to, let's say, 5,000 or 6,000 feet. I'm going to climb a bit higher than usual because I want to get us into some of the thinner air, so hopefully we can make faster progress than usual. Desert town here. We're off track. $4,000. Nice steep climb angle here. Climbing at 1,000 feet per minute, really going for it. Only doing 70 knots though, so a pretty steep climb. Just about ready to settle down now, I think. So I was going to have a play of IL2 a bit the previous weekend. They did some updates at the end of last week, and they announced they'd done some work on the damage model and things, which is surprising because I've spent the last year receiving a bombardment of notices and emails and reading forum posts and about how amazing the IL2 damage model was, and then I found out last week they've made some major overhauls and updates to it. So one always wonders whether something is as good as people say it is when you find out that the people who make that thing have suddenly decided to go and make major changes to it to improve it. I got the impression that it was near on perfect from some of the praise that platform was getting, and then a major update like that comes along and fundamentally changes some of those features that people rave about. Makes you wonder somewhat. But I didn't get the chance to have a look at it, unfortunately, over the weekend. I do find the control setup in IL2 Great Battles to be prohibitively annoying. There are just a number of features about how you set up the controls that are really not user-friendly at all. And every time I've gone to have a look at it, I've found myself spending a good deal of time in the control options. So it really frustrates me. Incidentally, Xplane 11 has possibly the best control setup I've ever come across in a flight sim. Right, we're going to level off here, and I'm also going to lean the mixture somewhat, just so we conserve a bit of that fuel. And we'll shove the autopilot on, heading and altitude. Right, airspeed's now picking up quite a bit. We're heading on 113. Desired track is 115, so we're going to come right just a touch. And RPM is really going for it now too. I'm just going to notch the RPM back. And we'll let the aircraft sit there. Bit more right track. Now I'm still on the VOR for Rafha where we left. And I don't think we've got the... No, we don't have the range to set the next navigational waypoint, and I don't know what the frequency is, so we're just going to ignore that and use the GPS and just hope it doesn't fail. But we do have we know what a heading is supposed to be, so long as we stay on about, well, so long as we stay on the 10, what radial are we on? Radially. We're on the 110 radial out of RAF, so as long as we stay on that, we can always turn around and fly back, of course. Fuel just starting to notch below 10, so we'll just have to keep an eye on that. Fuel flow's nice and low. Good. Now, here comes the interesting part of this flight. For those who've borne with me so far, and credit for this goes to Dietrich from the 17th Flieger Corps, who suggested that I read a book during these flights. So what we're going to do is we are going to start reading Johnny Johnson's autobiography, which is entitled Wing Leader, by Group Captain J.E. Johnson, DSO DFC. Now, this is a book I read as a teenager many times, and it is, as I said, the autobiography of the RAF's Johnny Johnson, who was the top credited RAF fighter pilot during the Second World War, and he was a Spitfire pilot. So we're going to read his book, and we'll just keep reading until we get close enough to Batin, Papa Alpha, to make our descent. And until we do, let's read. So, starting with Chapter 1, which is entitled The Volunteer Reserve. When the war ended in Europe, I commanded a Spitfire wing, and we were based at Celle, the most easterly of our airfields in Germany. Now that's either Celle or Celle. Probably Celle. Since the Rhine crossing some 6 weeks before, we had met the Luftwaffe almost every day, and although they were in a hopeless position, short of fuel and spares, and their airfields under constant bombardment, let it be said to their credit that they continued to fight until the end. During these past few weeks, when we patrolled the airfields and harried them from dawn till dusk, we had shot down over 100 enemy aircraft, including the latest jet and rocket-propelled types, the well-proven Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters, pilotless aircraft, pickerback contraptions, lumbering transports, bombers, and light communication aircraft. The Luftwaffe did not ask for quarter, and we flew hard against them until the morning of VE Day. We had lifted our Spitfires from the flare path into the black night and watched the dawn paint the earth with colour when we flew towards the rising light in the east. At low level we curved across Berlin, sparring cautiously with large gaggles of Russian fighters, and saw the surging tide of men and armour pouring through the open floodgates of Eastern Europe. Now that it was all over, the Germans flew in from Norway and Denmark to surrender. One arrogant young pilot landed with his brand new bomber at Celle and saluted smartly when I met him as he dropped from the cockpit. He was very pleased, he told us, now that the Luftwaffe no longer fought the Royal Air Force. But a common foe remained, and if we could fix him up with a few bombs and perhaps a Spitfire escort. He was still looking pained when we bundled him off to the nearest prisoner of war stockade. During the next few months, there was a difficult transition period from war to peace ahead of us. And my chief responsibility would not so much be the flying, but to make sure that upwards of 1,000 airmen left the service with pleasant memories. For the off-duty hours, the local streams were well stocked with brown trout, and in the autumn there would be some excellent wild fowling. There was black game to be flushed and shot on the wild barren heathlands, red deer and roebuck to be stalked in the brooding pine forests, and wild boar to be ambushed in the fields beneath the hunter's moon. All of this for the asking, and for the first time in 6 years there was the opportunity to get properly organised for such things. The day after it was all over, I drove slowly round the perimeter track and tried to get accustomed to the rare sight of 50-odd Spitfires squatting idle on the grass while the sun blazed down from a blue, clean sky. Suddenly, a lone aircraft, a captured Fiesler Storch, bearing our own markings, swung into view just above treetops and glided into land. This could only be our group commander, Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst, and I was on the tarmac to meet him before he switched off the engine. "Well, Johnny, how do you like the piping days of peace?" he asked. "I'm not sure, sir," I answered. "Seems odd to be sitting on the ground in this weather, but I suppose we'll get used to it." "You won't have to get used to it just yet," said the Air Vice Marshal. "I've got another job for you chaps." "Any idea what it is?" "Not the faintest, sir," I replied. "I think you'll like this one. We've been asked to send a token British force to Copenhagen. It should be great fun, and since your chaps have done so well recently, I'm giving you the job as a sort of bonus. Make the most of it, for I shall replace you after a month or so with another wing. You'd better get off to Copenhagen today and have a look at the accommodation. Get your chaps up there as soon as you can. I'll fly up in a few days' time to see you." I thanked the group commander, and after he left, I collected my wing leader and 1 or 2 other officers, jumped into an Anson and set course for the airfield at Kastrup, which lies on the southern flank of Copenhagen. We had enjoyed the liberation of Paris and had lived in some style in Brussels. A few weeks in Copenhagen would provide a fitting end to our trek across Europe. After a flight of about 90 minutes, I put the creaking Anson down on the smooth asphalt surface of the Kastrup runway. Crowds of people swarmed the tarmac: police, soldiers, resistance personnel, newspapermen, photographers, and attractive blondes. When we stepped out, we were immediately besieged by a battery of interrogators. "Are the Spitfires coming here? Where are the Russians? The Germans are still here. They will not surrender to you. They will not surrender to us. Perhaps you. Where is Monty? The Russians are at Bornholm, our island. Are they coming here? Please take these flowers," and so on. Eventually, some sort of order was restored. I explained the purpose of our visit. The Spitfires would soon arrive, probably tomorrow. A detachment of the famous 6th Airborne Division was on its way to Copenhagen and would take care of the German troops, who would soon leave Denmark. The Royal Navy would sail into the harbour within the next few days, and a military mission would soon be established to solve the various problems. All would be well. Meanwhile, if we could borrow a car to have a quick look at the airfield and the buildings, it would help to speed up the arrival of the Spitfires. A pre-war Buick was soon produced, and we decided that the airfield contained more than adequate accommodation for our modest needs. Food was not a problem, for even if supply organisation did not catch up with us for a day or two, the well-fed appearance of the Danes told us that here was an abundance of food. Our reconnaissance was therefore very brief, and we prepared to leave, for the quicker we got back to Celle, the sooner we should be firmly entrenched in pleasant Copenhagen. On the next day, it was a fairly long flight for the limited range of our aircraft, so we flew to Kastrup by squadrons. I led the first formation, and we flew over Lower Saxony and Schleswig-Holstein in loose, easy formation. But when we approached Copenhagen, I put the boys into a tight formation and we roared over the capital. I thought the Danes would appreciate the gesture. When we taxied to the large expanse of concrete in front of the administration buildings at Kastrup, the crowds were greater than before, and several of the pilots were almost dragged from their cockpits by the excited Danes. Perhaps it was a good thing that the fighting was over. Personally, I was ready for a rest from operations. The past was remembered not by the years but by the events. The Volunteer Reserve, the Battle of Britain, a gradual reach out across the Channel and over France, Dieppe, my first Canadian wing, Normandy, Paris, Brussels, Arnhem, and so finally across the Rhine and into Germany. Right, I'm going to stop reading this chapter for a moment just here while we go through a few checks to make sure that we are where we need to be, and then I'm going to procure myself a beverage for my parched throat. Right, we need to just sort track IR out a little bit and go through a few checks here. Fuel is still fine, T's and P's all look good, airspeed's fine, we're level, still at 6,000 feet, and we're on track 115. Distance now 131 nautical miles. So everything is proceeding very pleasantly. We can have a little look out the cockpit at the barren expanse of nothingness that really does extend into oblivion in all directions. I sure am going to be pleased to see the end of this desert. Let's have a little look outside. Really not very much to look at, so I'm going to fetch myself a drink and I'll be back in a short time and we'll continue reading our book with Johnnie Johnson. Okie dokie, back in the cockpit. Now, I have here a beer. It's from the Hohentanner Schlossbrauerei, which is from the Halledau here in Bavaria. And this particular one is the Grünhopfen, which is one of my favorites of theirs. It's made with green, freshly harvested, undried hops. And it's a very bitter... I guess it's kind of it's a bit ale-y, but it's just a very bitter Helles. It doesn't really qualify as a Helles at all. Sort of halfway between a lager and a pale ale. So it's a very tasty beer. Quite bitter for a Bavarian pale beer or a Helles. Not as hoppy as a full-on IPA like you would get from a Anglo-American craft brewery, but still, it's very tasty indeed. Now, we're going to carry on with our book. So, just reopening here. And Johnnie Johnson now skips back to his very early flying career before the war begins. So we'll start off, I think we're in 1938. I'm just going to pause track IR so it's not kicking around so much. I'll just get a nice view there out the front. So, After a great deal of hard work and cramming, and some luck in the professional examinations, the year 1938 found me, at 22, a fully qualified civil engineer and holding an appointment at Lawton, on the edge of Epping Forest. I joined the nearby Chingford Rugby Club, enjoyed some excellent games and the company of a very spirited collection of young men, most of whom were already serving in one or the other of the various territorial organisations. In one game, against Park House, I was brought down heavily on a frozen surface and broke my right collarbone. Although I did not know it at the time, the break was improperly set, and the nerves to the forearm were imprisoned below the bone. Later in 1940, this incident almost ended my active flying career. I tried to become a pilot in one of the squadrons of the Auxiliary Air Force. After some time, I was seen by an officer who, I learnt, was very keen on fox hunting. He asked me the usual questions: school, profession, sports, and whether or not I had any flying experience. Naturally, I laid great stress on the fact that I had already started flying instruction at my own expense. However, he did not appear to be impressed, and I had the distinct feeling that the interview would soon be concluded with the usual, "We'll let you know if we're likely to have a vacancy." But his flagging enthusiasm revived a little later when he learnt that I came from Leicestershire and that my hometown was Melton Mowbray. "That's a jolly good thing," he said. I know the country very well, as I hunt there quite a lot. Tell me, which pack do you follow?" When I tactfully explained that all my spare cash was devoted to flying, not hunting, the interview was speedily ended, and my services with an auxiliary squadron were not required until the shooting war had begun. The crisis of Munich gave way to a period of rapid rearmament and expansion of the auxiliary and territorial units. Once more I tried to join the Auxiliary Air Force. I was curtly informed that sufficient pilots were already available, but there were some vacancies in the balloon squadrons. Was I interested in this vital part of the defence organisation? I replied with similar brevity that I was not at all interested in flying balloons. One or two of my rugby friends had already joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve, had been taught to fly, and were well on their way to gaining the coveted wings only worn by qualified pilots. The VR had been formed in 1936, and its aim was to recruit a reserve of pilots. All entrants were at first in non-commissioned rank, and a reasonable number were commissioned when they got their wings. The VR was far less of a corps d'élite than the socially inclined Auxiliary Air Force, and it was with great expectations that I submitted my application to the Air Ministry. In due time it was acknowledged, but they regretted that for the time being they had far more candidates than vacancies in the VR training schools. However, should the scheme be expanded, then they would communicate with me in due course. Any hopes I had of ever joining one or the other of the part-time flying organisations of the RAF were now firmly put aside. I decided that I must join some other territorial organisation, as my civilian appointment was a reserved occupation and, should war come, I could not work up any great enthusiasm for building air raid shelters or supervising decontamination squads. Despite my lack of interest in the hunting field, I had learned to ride at an early age, and on my next visit to see my people at Melton Mowbray, I applied to join the Mounted Leicestershire Yeomanry. I was interviewed by the local troop commander and was pleased to find that he did not think it was necessary to know how to fly in order to ride a horse. Service with the Yeomanry was a very happy affair, and we spent many enjoyable days charging over the countryside on various manoeuvres. After all the long hours and the hard exercise, I returned to Lawton, a few pounds lighter in weight, to find an official-looking letter from the Air Ministry. It had been decided to expand the VR scheme, and they referred to my application of the previous year. If I was still interested, would I present myself at Store Street, the London headquarters of the VR, for the necessary medical examinations in 2 days' time. I was outside the doors when they opened. Together with a dozen other types, I was processed through the various stages of the stiff and lengthy medical examination. After lunch, having successfully negotiated the medicos, a few of us were ushered into the presence of a group captain, and without further ado were sworn in as sergeant pilots under training in the RAF Volunteer Reserve. I was told to report to a flying training school in Essex, Stapleford-Tawney, for my weekend flying, and that they would also welcome my attendance on the long summer evenings. We were informed that in addition to the flying, we were expected to report to Store Street on Tuesday and Thursday of each week for lectures in navigation, airmanship, armament, signals, and the like. We were warned in no uncertain terms that ground lectures and flying instruction had to proceed simultaneously, and should we neglect the classroom, then our flying would be stopped immediately. Attendance at Store Street on 2 evenings a week, together with flying tuition on suitable evenings and every weekend, meant that my time was fully occupied. Our flying instructors were, in the main, released short-term RAF pilots who earned a pleasant living by offering their services to those firms who had contracted with the Air Ministry to train various numbers of RAF pilots. Our ranks were made up of every walk of life, including farmers, engineers, stockbrokers, articled pupils, bank clerks, and young men who were beginning their professional careers. Competition was very keen, and at frequent intervals in our flying training we were tested for progress and general ability by competent flying instructors from the RAF proper. As a result of these tests, it was not an uncommon occurrence for a pupil to be washed out. So were those of us who either failed consistently to attend the ground lectures or fared badly in the various examinations. Despite the expansion of the VR, there was still a great pool of waiting candidates, and for every one of us who fell out, there were a dozen applicants ready to take his place. At Stapleford-Tawney, we newcomers received our instruction in tiger moths, while the veterans, who spoke a very different language, were watched with some reverence as they walked across the grass airfield to their waiting Hawker Hart aeroplanes. Sometimes the relative serenity of our small area of sky over Essex was shattered by the appearance of small formations of hurricanes from the nearby airfield at North Weald as they tore through the sky. "Keep a sharp lookout for those brutes," warned my instructor. "They come at you at terrific speed, head on, look no bigger than a razor blade." In late August, we received our mobilisation orders. We reported to Store Street, where we were simply told to return to our various homes, where detailed instructions would be sent. For a few days, we kicked our heels and idled away the time as best we could. All doubts that this was yet another scare were put aside when, on the 1st of September, the German army and the Luftwaffe combined to demonstrate to the rest of the world a new technique of warfare, the Blitzkrieg. The Royal Air Force was now fully mobilised, and already our fighter and light bomber squadrons had landed in France to form the advanced air striking force. Once more we reported to Store Street, but this time we were warned to bring our personal belongings. After listening to the broadcast by the Prime Minister and hearing London's sirens for the first time, several hundred of us were put on a train to Cambridge. On our arrival, we disgorged onto the platform and stood about in uncertain groups, for we had no inkling of the next move. Suddenly there arrived upon the scene an extremely neat, portly, red-complexioned warrant officer, whom we later discovered to be Mr. Dalby. We heard him muttering to himself as he fussed about the platform, "Never seen so many sergeants in all my life. Sergeants, sergeants, they're all sergeants, not a corporal among 'em." From this interesting soliloquy, we gathered that Mr. Dalby was not greatly impressed by his first contact with the volunteer reservists. He grabbed me by the arm. "Sergeant," with due emphasis on this important rank, which doubtless had taken him many long years to reach, "you're section leader of this crowd here," and he waved a deprecating hand in the direction of a mere 200 of my colleagues. Can you, Sergeant, form them up in fours and follow the first bunch which I shall lead? Are you capable of this, Sergeant? With the amount of dignity necessary for the occasion, I assured him that I could, and I was careful to call him Sir, a courtesy invariably rendered to one of warrant rank by a lesser mortal. And so, with Mr. Dolby buzzing up and down our long column, we marched through Cambridge to Jesus College, which was to be our home for the next few weeks. Right, so Johnny Johnson's arrived in Cambridge, and we better just check where we are. Still on track on 115, which is good news. Get the old track looking around here. Oh yeah, down to about 8 gallons on the left and 9 on the right. So we are chewing through fuel. We've got 100 miles nautical to go. Trucking along at 110. So everything's pretty peachy. So I think we'll continue reading now, just picking up my book here, and maybe we'll change the view a bit for this section. We'll go with a something like this perhaps, slightly different view. Right, so we're in Cambridge. Enthusiastic aircrew of the Volunteer Reserve continued to move into the various colleges, and Magdalen, St John's, Trinity and others soon received their quotas of wingless sergeant pilots. We were told that we should remain at Cambridge until such a time as we could be absorbed by the various flying training schools. Early in December, some 30 of us were called together and told that on the following day we were to march to Marshall's Airfield on the outskirts of Cambridge, where we would resume our flying training on Tiger Moths. Before the war, Marshall's had been a civilian flying school and, under contract to the Air Ministry, had trained a number of locally recruited VRs. Most of the peacetime instructors, now either officers or sergeant pilots, still remained, and for the next few months our destinies would be in their hands. Instructing is a great and difficult art, and it does not necessarily follow that a good pilot will make a satisfactory instructor. Some types we had the misfortune to fly with claimed to be so anxious to get on operations that their talents were wasted on a bunch of ham-fisted pupils. This attitude was reflected not only in their approach to their jobs, but also in the product they turned out. An untimely and ill-conceived criticism when a word of encouragement would have been more appropriate to the occasion often dismayed and retarded a nervous beginner. It was not uncommon knowledge that some washed-out pilots would have graduated had the right bond of understanding and confidence been established in the first instance between pupil and instructor. Personally, I was lucky at Marshall's, since 4 of us were assigned to Sergeant Tappan, and Tap, although to his face we addressed him with a respectful Sir, was the very best type of instructor. A gentle, unassuming man, he flew beautifully, and went to great lengths to foster a good spirit with his pupils. Tap could always find time to explain a tricky point of airmanship, and when we walked across the tarmac at the end of a period of dual instruction, he would retrace the pattern of the flight and make sure that the various lessons were driven home. Our course at Marshall's finished in the spring, at about the same time as the squadrons of the Luftwaffe and the armoured columns of the German army struck across the frontier of Germany into the territories of the optimistic neutrals. My logbook records that I left Marshall's with a modest total of 84 flying hours, and I had passed the various ground examinations. On our last evening, a few of us clubbed together and invited our instructors to dine at a local hostelry. We had a good party, but I detected a wistful air about the instructors when it was time to say goodbye. We were to move on to service flying training schools, where we would fly monoplane aircraft, and in 10 weeks, if all went well, we could anticipate joining our operational squadrons. But the instructors would remain at Marshall's, training batch after batch of beginners and with little opportunity of flying modern aircraft. Some of the keener types eventually badgered their way onto combat squadrons, but the majority remained anchored to the training machine, where they carried out their essential tasks throughout the war. So that concludes Chapter 1 of Johnny Johnson's Wing Leader. We'll now just check on progress. 91 miles remain. So still quite a flight ahead of us. Looks like we'll probably get through a whole nother chapter of J.E.J.'s book before we get to the other end of this flight. But I will take a bit of a break from reading because my throat's taken a bit of a beating, my vocal cords. Just noticed I haven't got my transponder on IDED. I'll just push that in now, so at least my full identification is being broadcast. So we're 70 from our departure and 87 away from our arrival. Not halfway yet. I'll come a couple of notches to the left here. Go through a bit of checks. Not seeing anything abnormal. We will do another fuel check. So we've gone through about 5 gallons in total. I'm saying we've gone through 3 on the left and 2 on the right, which means we're doing 10 nautical miles per gallon currently, and we've got 12 or 13 gallons left and 85 miles nautical to go, so we will be fine. We'll get there with about 4 gallons left. Certainly we'll need to top the aircraft up with more fuel for the next flight. Getting quite low here. Some more beer and a bit of a glance around. It's a beautiful way that the sun is affected. You can see this is really lovely here. So the sun sits there, and as I raise my head, it starts disappearing behind the trailing edge, and it just distorts a little. And then as it gets to the top of the window here, because of the curve in the window, it actually it doesn't disappear completely behind the trailing edge, even though I'm raising my head. And it's not till there the window distortion kind of disappears, and it allows the sun to disappear out of sight. It's quite amazing how it refracts and is bent through this window. They've done such a good job with the light in Xplane 11. Just really incredible. It's just little things like that. The way the sun bounces around through the different reflecting surfaces, or the different lens-like surfaces. The window must just curve in at the top there. Very smart indeed. probably going to be the longest single video on my channel by the time this is done. So let's have a little look at the fuel flow with the mixture here. I'm going to push the mixture full rich, and let's just watch the fuel flow gauge. Oh yeah, wow. Fantastic. Now we're sitting on about 6 gallons an hour. See if we can maintain that. We've got just under 80 nautical miles to travel, and we're doing 105 knots. So we've got about 50 minutes of flying ahead of us, and at 5 gallons to the hour here, we'll use another 5 gallons. So I'm gonna stick with my original figure that we should end up with about 4 gallons left when we land. This place is barren. Right, I'm just going to leave the cockpit again for a minute or two here, and then when I return we shall continue with Johnny Johnson's wing leader. Just had to go check on a 1-year-old child, and the 1-year-old child is still alive, so we can all relax. Right, I guess it's time for Chapter 2 of Wing Leader. Chapter 2 is entitled Training Days. So we'll pause track hour again here, get a nice view of all the instruments. That'll do. Right, Chapter 2, Training Days. With Butch Lyons, who was Jewish and operated a butcher's shop in a fashionable quarter of London, we drove from Cambridge to the flying training school at Sealand near Chester, where we were to continue our flying. We arrived at the guardroom late one Saturday evening and experienced some difficulty, for we were not included in the list of pupils to be accommodated in the sergeant's mess. After some inquiries, we found that a few of us had been recommended for commissions, and during our time at Sealand, we should be rated as officer cadets and live in the officers' mess. This was an important milestone in our progress, and we walked to the mess, where an aged servant conducted us to our quarters. Although we slept in wooden huts, the mess itself was a comfortable, permanent building where the food was superb and the service beyond reproach. The majority of the mess servants had served here for a number of years and bore themselves with a quiet dignity. Soon we were assembled by a young, self-assured flight lieutenant who took some pains to point out that as cadets we were very much on probation and our behaviour would be carefully watched. Once again, I was fortunate to have a good instructor, and Sergeant Broad sent me off solo in a Miles Master after 2 dual trips. The Master was a pleasant aircraft to fly, being reasonably fast and having a higher ceiling than anything we had flown so far. On a grey, leaden days, when the overcast hung low across the Cheshire Plain, I thrilled to the sensation of climbing through the cloud formations into the dazzling beauty of the sun-drenched cloud tops. Our time at Sealand was in marked contrast to the leisure of our Cambridge days. Towards the end of June, we scanned the headlines of the papers and listened to the momentous bulletins of the BBC. What remained of the squadrons of the advanced striking force had been withdrawn from a prostrate France. The epic withdrawal of the BEF had taken place, and high above Dunkirk beaches, fighter squadrons of 11 group had challenged the domination of the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts. All these great events were reflected in the tempo of our life at Sealand, and we flew throughout the weekends and from dawn until dusk in a determined attempt to speed up the complicated progress of the training machine. I had one unpleasant experience at Sealand. The Luftwaffe had made an accurate reconnaissance of the airfield, and once or twice we were attacked whilst night flying was in progress. It was therefore decided that in future this training would be carried out from an isolated satellite airfield where it was improbable that a dimly lit flare path would attract the enemy intruders. Late one afternoon, we climbed back into the back of a lorry and were driven in some discomfort to the distant base. Just before it got dark, half a dozen masters flown by our instructors appeared from the west and landed. A fair amount of thick haze and smoke drifted downwind from industrial Lancashire, and the visibility was very limited and getting worse. After some discussion, the senior instructor decided that night flying would take place. I was detailed to fly dual in the program, and before we took off I remembered the basic problem of instrument flight. Most of the flying on this dark, moonless night would be carried out on instruments, and I must take care not to fly by the seat of my pants. Once in the air, the feel of the aircraft as interpreted through one's natural senses bears absolutely no relationship to its actual attitude, which is always displayed correctly by the various instruments. Until one is fully experienced on instrument work and procedures, one is sometimes bewildered by the mental confusion arising from this conflict of feel and the true attitude of the aircraft. Such confusion can easily lead to a disturbed mental state when dangerous and fatal mistakes are made. My first few circuits with the instructor in the back seat giving a running commentary on the form, together with our position in relation to the flare path, were uneventful enough. And after an hour of this we taxied in for a break and a cigarette before my solo effort. The industrial smoke from the north had increased, and when I trundled the master across the grass I noticed with some dismay that visibility had worsened since our previous flight. I had a strong urge to turn back and simply say that the conditions were too bad for my limited night experience, but the winking green light from the end of the runway urged me on. Full of apprehensions, I tore down the uneven surface of the flare path. A bump or two and we were airborne. Wheels up, throttle back to climbing revs. Concentrate on the instruments, 500 feet and all's well so far. A slow climbing turn to port through 180 degrees and level out at 1,000 feet. Throttle back again, this time to cruising revs. Trim the master to fly with the least pressures from the feet and the hands. All set. The flare path is about 1,000 yards distant on the port side. Or is it? I peered from the cockpit, but all I could see were the airy, opaque reflections from the red and green wingtip lights on the swirling cloud. This was my third trip at night in the master and my second solo experience, and to make matters worse, I suddenly hit some turbulent air. The master didn't feel right, and in a moment of panic I had the most vivid sensation that she was plunging earthwards in a steep, twisting dive, and automatically I began to take corrective action. but the instruments revealed that she was flying straight and level with a slight tendency to climb. Concentrate on the instruments. I concentrate to such an extent that my grip on the stick is like a vice, and my feet are braced against the rudder pedals as if they were steel struts. Relax. Sing or swear or shout, but relax, and with only the slightest pressure from the feet and hands, climb through the cloud for safety and time to think. Right, so speaking of cloud, we are in it. So we've flown into quite a packet of cloud, and it's just beautiful, perfect timing there with the story from Johnny Johnson. So here we are, stuck in cloud at 6,000 feet, and in fact we're just at the cloud base. You can just see the base of the cloud. In fact, if we look out here, that was an incredibly beautifully timed arrival of some tippy weather. Sun is still pretty bright, so we're not that deep in here. Or is that a light from the cockpit reflecting off there? That may not be the sun at all. No, there's no cockpit. There's no bright cockpit lights here that I can see. I think it's a reflection. Who knows? Now the question is, should I continue reading or should we focus a little bit more on the flying here? We've got 57 nautical miles to go, so we've got 1/3 of the trip left. Fuel situation is fine. 6 and 7 gallons. Everything else is tickety-boo, holding our altitude. And we are tracking on 113, so we need to come 2 degrees, 3 degrees right. A couple of clicks. It's possible that we're just getting pushed left a bit by some breeze, so I'll give it another click to the right, and we'll try to bring it on to 117, 118 just for a wee while. Well, let's continue reading Johnson, because this is perfect considering that we're now in the cloud, so this is going to match our experience quite nicely. Well, I say that, but now he's launching into clear sky. At 3,000 feet we launched out into clear sky. There was no moon, but the stars seemed bright and friendly after a cold, treacherous belly of the cloud. Soon I could make out a vague but real horizon, and obtain some relief from the strain of the unaccustomed instrument work. Remote in a world bounded by cloud and stars, I found time to determine the next step, and reasoned judgment gradually replaced the near panic of a few moments ago. I had no radio to guide me back to the airfield, which was now shrouded in cloud down to about 600 feet. The local countryside was hilly. The foothills of the Welsh mountains were but a few miles away, and to the east the Pennine chain reared its formidable bulk. I had sufficient petrol for about half an hour, and in this time I had to be on the ground in one piece, either with the master or in my parachute. Oh, here we go. We've got a nice horizon now too. We've just come through that cloud. As you can see, we're now entering clear. So if I look behind, unfortunately there's no cloud behind me because Xplane has just decided to update the weather again and make all the cloud disappear. So we're entering a slightly different weather conditions. Got some light cumulus and many miles of desert still to go ahead of us. Back to Johnny Johnson. I was careful to fly for 5 minutes on one course and then turn onto its exact reciprocal for a similar period. In this manner I wouldn't drift from the vicinity of the airfield, which I must try and find. I would make my let down to the west, for this course would take me away from the hills to the flat Lancashire coast. I would descend to 500 feet, try to pick up my position, and if this proved to be impossible, I would climb and bail out. Now that I had a definite course of action, I felt considerably better, and I tightened the harness straps, checked my parachute webbing, and began the descent. The stars vanished as the master slipped into the top of the cloud, and once more we were imprisoned in a hostile world of clammy, swirling vapour. Now we're descending at 500 feet a minute, rather gentle but still fast enough to make a nasty hole in a hillside. Nonsense, concentrate on the job. Still in the clag at 1,000 feet. Once more tremors of fear wrestle with logic and training. 800 feet. At 600 the cloud thins and I see a glimmer of light from some remote farmhouse. Now a square search for the airfield, 2 minutes on each of the 4 legs, and then if I haven't found it, back through the clouds for the jump. 2 minutes to the south, no luck. 2 minutes to the west, and not a sign of activity. Then to the north, and I see a wavering pencil of light playing to and fro on the base of the cloud. I speed towards it, and as I circle over the thin beam, I see the lights of the flare path below. I have to repress a wild instinct to smack the master onto the flare path there and then. Deliberately, I carry out a wide, slow circuit and flash out the identification letter of my aircraft. My signal is acknowledged from the ground. I put her down and taxi into the dispersal, feeling quietly elated at having reached the ground without breaking either myself or the master. The senior instructor intercepted me as I walked away. "What happened to you?" he exclaimed. "I straightened out at 1,000 feet, sir, and I couldn't see the flare path. I was in cloud." "Yes, you were, you idiot. The cloud had dropped to 600 feet. Why didn't you stay below it?" I answered defensively. "I was briefed to fly circuits at 1,000 feet. I didn't know the cloud had dropped until I was in it." "I realize that," he said, "but surely you have enough sense to fly below cloud. It's obvious to me that you require far more night flying practice." It was equally obvious to me that he should have exercised better judgment than to permit an inexperienced pupil to fly solo under such conditions, so I smothered the strong resentment that flared up in me against that stupid man and went to bed. But we never flew again at night, except when there was a clear sky. Our course at Sealand ended during the last few days of July. 6 or 7 of us were interviewed by the commanding officer and recommended for commissions. We ordered our new uniforms, and a few days later we reported to an operational training unit at Hawarden, only a few miles from Sealand, where we would fly Spitfires for a few hours before joining our squadrons. Right, quick look at the GPS says we've got 43 and a bit nautical miles to go. This is really helping pass the time reading this book. I think I'm going to get to within about 25 nautical, and then we're going to descend to about say 2,500 above ground. So that means we'll probably need to descend to 4,000 indicated. Let's continue. The day I flew a Spitfire for the first time was one to remember. To begin with, the instructor walked me around the lean fighter plane, drab in its war coat of grey and green camouflage paint, and explained the flight control system. Afterwards, I climbed into the cockpit while he stood on the wing root and explained the functions of the various controls. I was oppressed by the narrow cockpit, for I'm reasonably wide across the shoulders, and when I sat on the parachute, each forearm rubbed uncomfortably on the metal sides. "Bit tight across the shoulders for me?" I inquired. "You'll soon get used to it," he replied. "Surprising how small you can get when one of those yellow-nosed brutes is on your tail. You'll keep your head down then, and get a stiff neck from looking behind, otherwise you won't last long." And with this boost to my morale, we pressed on with the lesson. After a further half hour spent memorizing the various emergency procedures and the handling characteristics, the instructor checked my harness straps and watched while I adjusted the leather flying helmet. "Start her up." I carried out the correct drill, and the Merlin sprang into life with its usual song of power, a sound no fighter pilot will easily forget. The instructor bellowed in my ear, "You're trimmed for takeoff. Don't forget your fine pitch, otherwise you'll never get off the ground. Good luck." And he ambled away with a nonchalant air, but I knew that he would watch my takeoff and landing with critical eyes. I trundled awkwardly over the grass surface, swinging the Spitfire from side to side with brakes and bursts of throttle. This business was very necessary, for the long high nose of the aircraft made direct forward vision impossible, and more than one pupil had recently collided with another Spitfire or a petrol Bowser. I reached the very edge of the airfield and before turning into wind carried out a final cockpit check. No aircraft was in sight on the circuit and I had the whole airfield to myself. I swung her nose into the wind. No more delays, now get off. Throttle gently but firmly open to about 4 pounds of boost. She accelerates very quickly, much faster than the master. Stick forward to lift the tail and get a good airflow over the elevators. Correct a tendency to swing with coarse rudder. No more bouncing about. We can't be airborne yet. Yes, we are, and already climbing into the sky. Things move fast in the Spitfire. Wheels up, pitch control back, and throttle set to give a climbing speed of 200 miles per hour. Close the hood. After a struggle, during which the nose rose and fell like the flight of a magpie, I closed the perspex canopy and the cockpit seemed even more restricted than before. I toyed with the idea of flying with the hood open, but I could not fly or fight at high altitudes in this fashion, and I must get acquainted with every feature of the plane. Now it was time to take a firm hand with this little thoroughbred, for so far she had been the dominant partner in our enterprise. I carried out an easy turn and tried to pick up my bearings. Not more than 4 or 5 minutes since takeoff, but already we were more than 20 miles from Hawarden. I flew back, gaining confidence with every second. A master looms ahead and slightly below. I overtake him comfortably and to demonstrate my superiority attempt an upward roll. But I forget to allow for the heavy nose of the Spitfire with sufficient forward movement of the stick and we barrel out of the manoeuvre, losing an undignified amount of height. Better concentrate on handling characteristics and leave the aerobatics for another day. Over Hawarden again. Throttle back to circuit speed. Hood open, all clear ahead. Wheels down and curve her across wind. Now the flaps and a final turn into wind. 120 miles per hour on the approach and we are too high. Throttle back and she drops like a stone. 100 miles per hour and over the boundary. Stick back and head over the side to judge the landing. Too high and in a semi-stalled condition we drop out of the sky to hit the unyielding ground with a hefty smack. As I suspected, my instructor had seen it all and was there when I switched off the engine. I saw the Spit get you in the air, and given a fair chance she would have carried out a better landing than yours. If you make a mess of your approach, open up and go around again. You've been told that with every plane you've flown. Get into the front seat of that master and I'll show you a Spitfire circuit. To be relegated back to the second team, as it were, was a severe jolt to my pride. Right, I've got her, Johnson. We're on the downwind leg. The Spit is heavier than the master and soon loses height when you cut the power, so make your circuit tight and try to get a steady continuous turn from here. It looks good. You're down quickly, and if you're turning you can watch the sky behind. Remember that when you're down south, for you're a sitting duck in the circuit. Wheels down and adjust the trim. Flaps down, continue the turn. Now into wind, plenty of height, perhaps a little too much, so we side slip a bit off. So, throttle right back, ease back the stick and check her. She's sinking, stick right back and she's down. Piece of cake, isn't it? 4 days later I made a mess of the approach, but this time with disastrous results. I had been instructed to land at Sealand and deliver a small parcel of maps which was stuffed in my flying boot. The circuit at Sealand was crowded with masters, and I weaved amongst them for a favourable interwind position. There was a stiff wind across the short grass airfield, and I aimed to be down close to the boundary fence so that I had the maximum distance for the landing run. I came over the fence too high and too slow, and the fully full Spitfire dropped like a bomb. We hit the ground with a mighty crash, and I had little too much slack in the harness straps, for I was thrown violently forward and pulled up with a nasty wrench. Okay, I've just seen a little message come up here on Xplane telling me that I have run out of scenery, I think. So with 28 miles to go, we appear to be flying sceneryless. So let's just hope that we manage to get to the airfield before we completely run out here. Desired track is 116, we're on 117, so that's all fine. We've got 27 to go. So we'll continue reading to the end of the chapter and then we'll get back into focusing on the aircraft. Right, so he was just violently thrown forward and he pulled up with a nasty wrench across his shoulders. For a few yards we tore a deep groove into the ground, then she slithered to a standstill in a ground loop which tore off one undercarriage leg and forced the other through the top of the port main plane. I switched off the petrococks and the ignition switches and stepped out. The duty officer, an immaculate flight lieutenant complete with webbing and revolver, stepped out of a car and eyed me coldly. It was quite apparent you were going to prang. You were too high, too slow, not enough power, a poor approach. Don't you know the country's short of Spitfires? What do you want here anyway? I was told to deliver these, I replied, and handed him the maps. I found my way back to Harwarden and reported the dismal facts to the flight commander. He was a good type and made allowances for the fact that I was trying to get into a very short airfield. He had me airborne in another Spitfire very shortly afterwards, and I heard no more about the incident. But I was suspect, and knew that my flying was watched closely. Another prang, and I would certainly be washed out. At this time, the problem of fighter command was not so much the replacement of Hurricanes and Spitfires as the maintenance of steady, continuous flow of pilots to the operational squadrons. The number of trained pilots was far less at the beginning of September 1940 than at the corresponding time in August. A further reason for some anxiety was the fact that we VRs, who were replacing casualties, were not of the same high quality as the dead and wounded pilots. Time at Harwarden was spent learning how to fly the Spitfire. During my last few days there, I never fired the 8 guns or took part in any tactical training. This would come later, if there was time. Our instructors were a seasoned bunch of fighter pilots, most of whom had fought in France, over Dunkirk, or in the preliminary phases of the Battle of Britain. 1 or 2 of them wore the mauve and silver ribbon of the Distinguished Flying Cross, but they really spoke to the pupils of their combat against the Messerschmitts. The unit at Harwarden had only been formed a short time, and lectures on combat tactics had not yet been devised. How we longed for this knowledge! What went on when flights of Spitfires and Messerschmitts met? When squadron met squadron and wing encountered wing? Could the 109 turn inside us? What about their new cannon that fired through the hub of the propeller? What happened when they hurtled down from out of the sun? Were they aggressive, these fighter pilots, who had inherited the traditions of von Richthofen, the Red Knight of the First World War? And what about their formation leaders, who had tested their aircraft and tactics in the Spanish Civil War? What was the most important asset of a fighter pilot? To shoot straight, to keep a good lookout, or to be able to stay with his leader at all times? All these and 100 other questions remained unanswered, for the handful of instructors hung together and had their work cut out to keep the sausage machine churning. But occasionally, after a few beers, they struck up an animated conversation amongst themselves, and we heard of tailing Charlies and Weavers. These conversations only served to confuse me, and I left Harwarden with anything but a clear idea of what took place when Spitfire met Messerschmitt. I think this was true of every inexperienced fighter pilot who joined his squadron at this stage of the war. Perhaps there was no shortcut, no easy way to the lessons that could be learnt by hard experience alone. Certainly with me it was only after many flights against the enemy that I could begin to trace the fabric of an air battle with its intricate and swift-moving patterns. Towards the end of August, I was called into the adjutant's office and told to report to 19 Squadron at Duxford, near Cambridge. I packed my few possessions and set out to travel across England by train. I had a total of 205 hours in my log, including 23 hours on Spitfires. So that concludes Chapter 2. We are now going to set up for a landing. We are apparently 18 nautical miles out, and I'm going to have to look around, see if I can get a visual on the field. Should be slightly to the left. In fact, I've got quite a lot of there is something up there. I think I've got a flare path. Yes, I've got a flare path. So we've got visual on the airfield. I believe that's our airfield. And we have 16 nautical miles. So I'm going to descend a little bit here, and we'll start a left turn shortly. Gonna line up. Not actually sure which is the active runway here. Right, we're going to tune nav radio in. So nav 1 is now tuned to destination field. Quite a big town down here actually. So mixture full rich. I'll leave the lights as they are for now. Check that the voltage is okay. Good amps there. Fuel check. Plenty of fuel. Yeah, a few gallons each tank, it's enough. Cock's on, shadow valves closed, flaps in the up position. A few vehicles down there. Moving about the highways. Getting on towards sunset by the looks of it. Yeah, the reflection's well behind us now. Don't think we'll get wind conditions on the map here. No, there's no wind showing. Okay, so we will probably be landing. Yeah, we'll probably be landing downwind if we're going from this direction, so I'm going to turn and we'll land into wind, because it looks like the wind at altitude is 253 from 253. Is that a, although that's actually, it's almost a crosswind. Doesn't matter. Pretty much perpendicular to this field. We took off towards the west when we got airborne. I'm going to land towards the south-southeast. I'll put the landing light on in a few moments. It's quite dark out there. Kind of feels almost like a instrument landing to some respects, to some degree, in some respects. Let's turn our landing light on. For some reason the beacon, it's on, we're okay. Still quite high here, but we're a good distance out from the field still, so plenty of time to correct. And we'll start a lazy turn to the right now. We'll call this a base turn. First notch of flat will go down in a few moments. Put us on 1500 RPM. Nicely lit. Nicely lit indeed. So I've got three exits. I've got a near one at the near threshold, I've got one halfway down, and I've got one at the far end. And there's no traffic on the ground or in the air. Okay, so we're high. Side slip, Spitfire style. I think we're going to be going around here because we do not seem to be losing any altitude. Way too quick to get the flaps down. It's actually given me a good feeling for what height the airfield's at. Okay, we're going around. The reason I'm continuing this approach is I want to actually get the airfield altitude. Okay, I think the airfield's at 1,300. No, let's make it 1,200. So, we'll go around. So, we'll go to 1,700 and we'll do a very short circuit here. Okay, we're basically almost crosswind. Sorry, almost downwind. Yeah, that's about past the cross and into the downwind now. And we get to about 2,000. Well, that's 1,700, so it's half the circuit height. I'm going to get to 1,000. I'll get to 1,000 feet above ground. There we go. Okay, we're parallel to the runway now, and we're 1,000 above runway. I'm going to slow the aeroplane down. Get ourselves in a position to make the descending base turn, and then we'll descend the last 500 feet. Okay, let's tip in. Try and tip in with the same angle as we came out. About there somewhere. Oh, we're not sinking nearly enough. I need to shed 500 feet. Blimey. Refusing to drop. There we go. Now we're losing some altitude. Too high again. I'll just do a long landing, I think. Alright, flaps. I cannot slow this airplane down. Alright. So it's going to be a long landing, but we've got a very long strip here. So we don't need to be too concerned about that. Okay, so we made it. Let's get the RPM back up before we break something. Taxi light on. Flaps are now in the fully up position. Struggling to keep this aeroplane slow. If I go any lower than that, then I run the risk of fouling the spark plugs. As you can see, it's long old taxi right to the end because we... Oh, is there an exit there? No. Now, I can't go any slower than this. If I idle the engine, then I have problems with the... And if I put... Okay, I can go brakes both fully on, that's okay. Just taxis a little bit too quickly, and then you run the risk of going off the end of something. But there we go, we've got to the end of this flight as we see the setting sun here. Something very noisy from behind me here. I'm going to taxi off onto the grass because there's no parking spots here. Okay. There we go, we're at the end. And we'll have a quick watch of that landing now. Right, here's the approach. As we came in the last couple of 100 feet or so, much too high. I really could have done with getting the QFE for the field. You can see we've got a bit of a tailwind and a crosswind there. Actually, it's probably stronger than I realised. I probably should have been landing into wind. That would have helped a lot. I think I just was getting pushed along by the wind quite considerably here. Let's see how we touched. One wheel then the other, and for some reason generating a lot of dust from the wheels. Or is that supposed to be I think that's because it thinks the brakes are on. Yeah, that's because Xplane thought that the handbrake was on, so even though it was in replay mode, it thought the handbrake was on, so it was causing me to burn my tyres there. But that's fine, that wouldn't have happened in the original. There we go, we are done here. We have completed our second to last flight across the desert. The next flight will take us to the Gulf Coast, finally. So, thanks for watching, as usual. Hope you enjoyed the story, and next flight I think we'll continue reading Johnny Johnson. That was quite entertaining for me and helped keep myself entertained throughout the flight.